What would you do if the only inheritance you'd ever been given, a piece of paper and a stranger's goodwill, was torn from your hands the moment you arrived to claim it? For Fiona Kerr, a young woman of 22 with a leather saddler's awl in her coat pocket and nothing else to her name, that question was not a hypothetical. It was the cold mud of a November morning in Greystone Landing, British Columbia, pressing up through the thin soles of her boots. She had traveled 4 days by wagon and river ferry from Vancouver, sleeping on the benches of supply boats and eating bread she'd wrapped in a kerchief 2 days prior. She arrived looking like what she was, a girl with a dead man's will and no one in the world to vouch for her. The dead man was Ernest Quay, a saddler and leather craftsman, who had kept a small workshop at the edge of Greystone Landing for the better part of 2 decades. He had no children, no wife. What he had was a quiet reputation for the most precise stitching in the Fraser Canyon and a fondness for taking on apprentices who had nowhere else to go. Fiona had been his last. She'd come to him at 17, sent up from the city by a church that had run out of patience with a girl who had no family connections and too many opinions. Ernest had opened his workshop door, looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, and said, "Pull up a stool. Let's see if your hands are any good." They were. She learned everything from him. How to cut leather along the grain, how to saddle stitch so the thread locked itself, how to read the character of a hide the way other people read a person's face. When Ernest died of a lung fever in the late autumn of 1887, he left her his tools, his workshop, and the small plot of land it sat on, recorded in a handwritten will, witnessed by a traveling Methodist minister named Reverend G. Hollis, whose name and flourishing signature appeared at the bottom. Fiona carried that will in an oilcloth sleeve tucked inside her coat, pressed against her ribs. In her pocket, she carried Ernest's awl, bone-handled, the initials EQ, burned carefully into the grip. It was shorter than her hand, a small thing, but it had been his most used tool, the one he reached for without looking. She didn't know exactly why she'd brought it. She supposed it was the closest thing to his presence she could carry. She had hoped, walking up the main road of Greystone Landing that gray morning, that presenting the will would be a simple business, a formality. She was wrong. The land office was a low-ceilinged room that smelled of tobacco smoke and damp wool, attached to the back of the general stores on Mill Street. Clifton Marr, the settlement's land commissioner, sat behind a wide desk, as though he'd grown there organically over the years. He was a broad, florid man in his late 50s, with a signet ring on his right hand, and the careful manner of someone who has long since learned to make contempt look like patience. He took the oilcloth sleeve from Fiona. He opened it. He read the will, or made a performance of reading it, and then he set it on the desk and folded his hands over it. "I'm afraid this document doesn't hold," he said pleasantly. Fiona had been standing for 5 minutes without being offered a seat. "It's a witnessed will," she said. "Reverend Hollis signed it." "The Reverend Hollis," said Marr, "is not a licensed witness under the Land Act of British Columbia. This will was improperly attested. The Quay property has already been assessed as abandoned and recorded as Crown land available for re-grant." There were 2 other men in the room, a young clerk near the window, and a large, quiet man named Duff Crail, leaning against the far wall with the expressionless patience of a dog, waiting outside a butcher shop. They watched Fiona, with the mild interest people, show it something they already know the outcome of. "Mr. Quay died 5 weeks ago," Fiona said quietly. "The land hasn't been abandoned. I'm here to claim it." Marr's expression shifted into something that looked almost like sympathy. "Miss, what did you say your name was?" "Kerr, Fiona Kerr." "Miss Kerr," he said it the way one might say child. "I understand you've come a considerable distance. That speaks well of your determination. But a girl your age alone, trying to operate a saddler's workshop in a settlement like this." He paused. "Even if the will were valid, which it is not, the most sensible outcome here would be for you to accept the assessed value of the personal property, take what tools you can carry, and return to the city. There are establishments in Vancouver that take on seamstresses, young women who are skilled with a needle. You'd be far more comfortable." The clerk near the window was studying his ledger. Duff Crail had not moved. Fiona kept her voice even, though the cold knot in her chest was expanding. "I don't want an assessed value. I want the workshop." Marr stood. "Then I'm afraid I can't help you today. The property has been re-granted. Someone else will be taking possession of the Quay workshop by the end of the month." He picked up the oilcloth sleeve and held it out to her. "Good morning, Miss Kerr." She took it. There was nothing else to do. Outside, the November sky had gone the color of pewter. Fiona stood on the wooden sidewalk and breathed cold air until her hands stopped shaking. A woman passing with a basket of groceries glanced at her and looked quickly away. Down the road, two loggers were loading a wagon, their voices cheerful and loud. In the cold, the town went about its business as though she were a stone in a riverbed, something the current simply moved around. She was a girl with no money, no local connections, and a will that had just been declared worthless by the only man in the territory, with the authority to declare things worthless. She could feel the shape of her situation the way you feel a room go dark. Not all at once, but in degrees. But she still had the key to Ernest's workshop. She'd found it in his coat pocket after he died, and it had not occurred to her to leave it behind. She found the workshop that afternoon, set back from the main road, past a stand of alder trees whose bare branches clattered softly in the wind. It was exactly as Ernest had described it in his letters. A low wooden building with a wide workbench beneath the north window, the smell of tallow and leather and linseed oil, so thick in the walls it came at her like a voice when she opened the door. She let herself in. She needed, more than anything, to sit in a place that had been his and think. She was on her knees by the cold stove, feeding kindling into it, when the door opened behind her. It was Duff Crail. He didn't say much. He said the property was already under the commissioner's authority. He said she was trespassing. He said she needed to leave the key on the workbench. He said all of this in the tone of a man performing a task he finds mildly tiresome, and then he took her by the arm and walked her out the door. She dropped the key when his hand closed on her arm. She heard it fall somewhere in the muddy grass near the workshop's corner foundation. He didn't notice. In that moment, neither did she. She was left at the edge of a dirt road, 3 days' travel from anyone who knew her name, with the November dusk coming on and the temperature dropping fast. We will pause here for just a moment, because this is the part that matters most. Fiona Kerr was 22 years old. She had never been given much, and what she'd been given had just been taken. She was frightened, and she was cold, and she was alone. What she did next was not brave in any grand sense. It was simply the only thing left. She went back to the workshop. Not through the door, she had no key. Through a gap in the rear wall where two planks had warped apart from the foundation settling. It was barely wide enough for her shoulders. It was the kind of entrance you only find in the dark, when your hands are flat against the wood, and you have nothing to lose by feeling your way. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done? And if this story is reaching you the way we hope it is, we'd be glad to have you stay with us a little longer. There are more stories from places like Greystone Landing, and we don't want you to miss a single one. Inside, the dark was total. She found the stove by memory and lit it with the box of matches from her coat pocket. Ernest had always kept matches in his coat pocket, and she had inherited the habit. The small fire threw ochre light across the workbench, the hanging bridle straps, the rows of awls and needles and punches on their wooden rack. She sat on the stool she had pulled up, the first day Ernest told her she could. She put her head in her hands. She had almost decided on the floor as a place to sleep when something made her stop. It was not a sound exactly, it was the absence of one, a dead quality to the air in the far corner of the workshop, behind the heavy oak shelving unit where Ernest kept his supply of unworked hides. A faint smell she hadn't registered in the shock of everything else. Not leather, not linseed. Something older, something like riverstone and cold clay. She held the match closer. There was a gap between the shelving and the back wall, narrow, perhaps 4 inches, but continuous from floor to ceiling. She pressed her palm flat against the back wall. It was cold in a way the other walls weren't. She moved the shelving unit. It took everything she had. The legs scraped against the floorboards, loud as a shout in the still room. Behind it was a door, barely a door, a section of wall built to look like wall, with a wooden peg handle flush to the frame. The space behind it was small, more of a storage alcove than a room, perhaps 2 arm lengths deep, 1 wide. Shelves had been built into the sides with a carpenter's care. On them were stacked oilcloth-wrapped parcels, a pair of lanterns with oil still in them, and a tin box no larger than a hat box, sealed at the seam with a ring of wax. Fiona lit one of the lanterns. She sat on the floor of the alcove and broke the seal. Inside, 2 folded packets of papers and a small cloth-bound notebook. Not a supply ledger, a personal one. Ernest's handwriting, which she knew as well as her own. She read through the night. What Ernest Quay had spent the last year of his life quietly, methodically assembling, was not what she would have expected from a saddler of 63. But then Ernest had always insisted that the most useful skill a craftsperson could develop was attention. Look at everything, he'd told her once, and never assume you know what you're looking at until you've looked twice. He had looked twice, and then many times more. It had begun, he wrote, when Commissioner Clifton Marr brought his saddle in for repairs. A fine piece of work, calfskin over an iron tree, worth more than most men in the settlement earned in a month. Ernest had found in the saddlebag pocket a folded document. He'd read it before he understood what it was. By the time he understood, he couldn't unread it. It was a deed transfer for a farm on the western edge of the valley. The family name on the original grant was Brennan. The name on the new transfer was one of Marr's associates. The surveyor's seal was correct. The commissioner's seal was correct. The date of transfer, however, was 2 months before the Brennan family had any recorded intention of leaving their land, and 3 months before they actually did. The document had been prepared in advance. The departure had been engineered after the fact. Ernest had not been a man of dramatic action. He had returned the saddle, said nothing, and begun paying attention with a saddler's patience and a craftsman's eye for detail. The notebook contained 6 months of careful observation, 14 families, 14 land transactions with dates that didn't match, 11 deeds whose surveyor's signatures, placed side by side, showed a subtle, consistent drift, the kind that happens when the same hand traces the same name over and over until it grows careless. A forger's error, invisible one at a time, unmistakable in collection. The 2 folded packets were copies, painstaking, handwritten copies of the fraudulent deeds, cross-referenced in Ernest's precise handwriting. He had attended every open claims board meeting for 6 months. He had borrowed documents under pretext of checking his own filing and returned them with his copies made. He had known why Marr would eventually want that workshop gone. And he had made this room and filled it and sealed it against the day he either couldn't keep the secret any longer or couldn't keep himself alive. At the bottom of the tin, she found the unsent letters. They were addressed to the Territorial Surveyor's office in New Westminster. He had been preparing to send the records when the fever came. She closed the notebook. She held it the way she had once held his hand in the last days of that fever, when there was nothing left to say, and both of them knew it. He had been trying to finish this. She would finish it for him. Seward Blythe found her the next morning. Or rather, she found the smoke from his chimney and followed it, because she needed someone and he was the only one close enough. He lived a quarter-mile east of the workshop in a cabin set back into the tree line, a man who had shaped his life around its own edges since his brother, Neil, had died in a mill accident 18 months prior. He was 38, lean and deliberate in his movements, with the kind of quietness that comes from sustained grief rather than from nature. He was at his door before she reached the porch steps, a rifle loose in one hand, watching her come across the November field with a lantern and a tin box. "I know who you are," he said before she introduced herself. "Ernest talked about you." She told him what she had found. Not all of it, not yet. She was still a stranger to him, and the documents in that box were the only cards she held. She told him about Marr, about Duff Crail, about being put out of the workshop. She told him there was something hidden in that workshop that Marr didn't know existed yet, and that she needed to get it out before he did. Seward set his rifle against the door frame and looked at her for a long moment. He had his own reasons to distrust Clifton Marr, reasons he hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. Neil's death had been called an accident. The mill's owner had sold the property to one of Marr's associates within 3 weeks, for a price that bore no relationship to the land's value. Seward had called it a coincidence in those early weeks because the alternative was too large to carry alone. "Let me see what you've got," he said. They spread Ernest's papers on the kitchen table, and Seward's face changed the way a room changes when a window is finally opened. Not dramatically, quietly. Something long held in was suddenly able to breathe. "The Brennan family," he said softly, his finger on one of the deed copies. "They didn't want to sell. I know that for a fact. Old Joe Brennan told me himself, the winter before they left, that the land had been in his wife's family for 40 years. They were going to be buried there." He looked up at Fiona. "They were gone by spring. Marr told everyone Joe had a mining debt he couldn't cover." The documents in Ernest's hand said otherwise. The timeline said otherwise. Everything said otherwise, laid out with the patience of a man who had stitched together truth the same way he stitched leather. One puncture at a time, each one locked before moving to the next. They worked through the afternoon. 2 of the 14 families Seward knew personally. 3 more he could place to specific dates and events that now read entirely differently against the forged paperwork. Neil's accident had occurred the same week. Ernest's notebook recorded that Mara had noticed his unusually frequent attendance at the claims board meetings. A coincidence, perhaps, or a warning aimed sideways at a sick old man to make him think twice. He didn't have to move against Ernest directly, Fiona said, working through the dates. Ernest was already ill. Mar just needed to move quickly enough that the fever won before the records could be sent. And then you walked in and found everything, Seward said. They looked at each other across the table, with the particular understanding of 2 people who have arrived, separately and by accident, at the same dangerous point. By evening they heard boots on the frost-hard ground outside. Duff Crail had been thorough. He'd found the gap in the workshop's rear wall, found it, and found the alcove behind the shelving, and found it empty, which meant he was now working outward from that point, with the logic of a man who understood that something had been taken. Seward's cabin was the next stop on that logic. There was no back door. There was a window. Seward went through it first, handed Fiona the tin box through the opening, and they were in the tree line before Crail's knock turned into Crail's shoulder against the door. The night was moonless and cold enough that their breath made small white shapes in the dark. Seward knew these trees. He had worked them for 12 years and grieved his brother among them. He moved without hesitation, and Fiona followed the sound of his steps. They pushed northeast for 2 hours. Seward had horses. They were gone before first light. The Northwest Mounted Police Detachment at Hope was a 2-day ride in good weather. November is not good weather in the Fraser Canyon. They rode through one morning of freezing rain and one of wind that came off the river like a flat hand, and they arrived looking like what they were. 2 people carrying evidence that made them considerably more trouble than they'd bargained for. The officer in charge was Sergeant D. Farquhar, a compact Scotsman who had seen enough in 15 years of service to be difficult to surprise. He listened to Fiona and Seward without interruption. He read Ernest's notebook. He examined the deed copies. He held 2 surveyor's signatures side by side against the window light for a long time without speaking. "How long ago did you take these from the property?" he asked. 2 nights ago, Fiona said. "And the original documents, the ones Quay copied from?" "Still in the land office. Filed correctly. That's what makes them dangerous. They look right, one at a time. You have to see them against each other." Farquhar set the papers down. He was the kind of man who had decided long ago that his job was simply to do the right thing, whatever administrative difficulty that involved. Fiona had met very few such people in her life, but she recognized one immediately. "We'll need a writ from the territorial court," he said, "and we'll need to move before Mar has time to relocate or destroy those originals." He stood. "You 2 had better be right about this." "We are," said Seward. "Ernest Quay spent 6 months making sure we would be." The arrest of Clifton Marr and 2 of his associates, carried out by Sergeant Farquhar and 3 constables in the second week of November 1887, was not a dramatic affair. There was no standoff, no grand unmasking. Marr was brought out of his office in handcuffs, bewildered and then furious, and then. As the constables walked him past, the small knot of settlers who had gathered in the road simply diminished. Duff Crail gave a statement that morning that corroborated enough of the detail to close the remaining gaps. The records were seized. A territorial surveyor brought in from New Westminster confirmed, within 2 hours of examining the originals, what Ernest's notebook had laid out with such painstaking care. 14 transactions, 11 forged signatures. The surveyor's voice was flat and professional, but Fiona noticed his hands tighten on the documents when he read certain names. In the weeks that followed, 4 families were notified that their land grants would be restored. 2 others had already sold to third parties in good faith. Their cases moved more slowly through the territorial process. The Brennan family, reached through a cousin in the Okanagan, wrote back within the month. Old Joe Brennan, his wife reported, had not been surprised. He had always said there was something wrong about how it happened. Seward Blythe's brother Neil could not be brought back. But the mill property reverted to independent management, and the manner of his death was re-examined. The inquiry found no direct evidence of foul play, but it found enough to record, formally, that the circumstances had never been adequately investigated. It was not justice, exactly. It was the beginning of a record that told the truth. Seward said that was enough. Fiona was not sure she entirely believed him, but she understood the grace of the decision. That winter passed slowly, and with difficulty, the way honest winters do. By March, the frost had begun to pull back from the ground in the mornings, and the alders along the road had their first cautious green. The workshop was returned to Fiona under a corrected land grant, the commissioner's re-grant voided, along with everything else Marr had put his seal to. She rebuilt the stove with a new liner that Seward sourced from the ironmonger in Hope. She repaired the shelving. She rehung the rack of tools on its proper wall. The day she reopened the workshop, she found the awl still in her coat pocket. She had carried it every day through everything, without once thinking about it consciously. She took it out and set it on the workbench where Ernest had always kept it, handle angled toward the right hand the way he'd preferred. She looked at it for a long time. The first customer came that afternoon, a farmer from 2 properties over, needing a trace repaired before the spring planting. She sat him down, looked at the worn leather, and got to work. Seward built a small addition to the workshop that spring, a covered porch where leather could be stretched to dry without warping in the rain. He was not a man of many words about what he was doing or why. He simply arrived on a Saturday with lumber and set to work, and she brought him lunch, and that was how things began between them. Some evenings, when the light held long into the supper hour the way it does in the canyon country in May, she would sit on the new porch and look out over the property. The alder trees, the river glinting in the distance, the mountains going blue at their ridges. She thought about Ernest sometimes, about the patience it had taken to do what he did, alone, sick, knowing he was running out of time. About the fact that he had believed, without ever saying so, that someone would come, that someone would find it. She had not come for a hidden ledger. She had come for a workbench and a set of tools and the small, dignified future of a woman who knows her craft. That was still what she had. Everything else had simply come with it, the way a key sometimes comes attached to a house you didn't know you needed. There are people in this world, we think, who leave things behind deliberately. Not because they've given up, but because they've done the mathematics and decided that what they've prepared will outlast what they could carry. Ernest Quay was one of those people. He left Fiona his tools, his land, and a room full of truth, and he trusted her, without ever asking, to know what to do with all 3. She set the bone-handled awl on the workbench each morning. By afternoon, she was always already reaching for it without looking. That's what it means to carry something that was always yours. We hope this story from Greystone Landing has stayed with you a little, the way the true ones do. Not loudly, but underneath everything. If it reached you, we'd love to know. Was there something someone left behind for you? Something you didn't understand the value of until much later? Tell us in the comments. And if you haven't already, come and stay a while. There are more stories like this one, and we'll see you next time.